Hello, welcome to Upper Newport Bay. I'm Tom Morris from Fullerton College, and this is a video for my environmental biology lab students at Fullerton College. And we are at Upper Newport Bay to do the first Upper Newport Bay exercise, and it is called a community mapping and community survey at Upper Newport Bay. And so you're going to need to go on the course page on Canvas, and recommend you download this document and have it available for you, because I'm going to be drawing on it and you're going to be taking notes on some things. Let me show you what we're going to be doing. There is an aerial photograph we're going to be working on today. I'm going to get you started on that. We're actually going to color in all of this area in here on this aerial photograph, and then all the way over to here. Let me show you where we are right now. Just so you can get your bearings. We are at the intersection of East Bluff Drive and Back Bay Drive in Newport Beach. So we're on the little Vista Point overlook right here. This is East Bluff and this is Back Bay Drive. So let's talk about why we're here. We're here to do a community mapping. We're going to map out ecological communities, and an ecological community is it's kind of an assemblage of plants and animals and other living things that tend to live together, and they tend to live together in a sort of a defined geographic area. The reason that they live together is they self-organize, and they self-organize based on the physical properties of that particular geographic area. And so as you travel across the landscape, as the physical properties of the land change, so does the mix of plants and animals. And as a consequence, well, let me also say this, that in any given ecological community, the plants and animals that live there share similar properties. We're going to focus on plants today. So the plants tend to look similar. They tend to have similar properties. Like there'll be trees and shrubs in one place, and there'll be short grasses in other places. And the reason for that is because the physical properties can change. So as you travel across the landscape, as the physical properties change, so does the mix of plants and animals. And so we can see that. And also as if you look out on the landscape, and we're going to look at a few here, as you see different mixes of plants and animals, that is an indication of changes or differences in the physical properties. At any rate, we're going to be using the concept of community. So based on that, we ought to be able to actually see different communities just based on the appearance of plants. So what I want to do is I want to have you look over where I'm going to point, and down basically to our north and a little bit to the northwest over here, you'll see a stand of trees over there. Trees and tall shrubs. And that represents a part of one community. And then that stand of trees comes this way, and then we see it at the bottom of the bluff that we're standing on right now. And then if you gaze over farther to your right, you'll see there's another little thumb of trees and shrubs that sticks out over here. So that's pretty recognizable. You can see the trees and the shrubs. That's one community. Now, let's go ahead and map that community out. So what I'm going to do on this map, and what I'd like for you to do, because by the way, you're going to get a quiz, an online quiz on this activity. So you're going to need to know, and that online quiz is going to be based on this packet and the notes that you make. And you're going to need to know the locations of the various communities that we're going to be coloring in today. So let's do the trees. I'm going to use green for my color. And I'm going to outline, so we're here, we're looking north and northwest a little bit. I can see the trees very nicely shaded in on my little grayscale image here, and I'm just going to draw a little outline. Those are the trees and shrubs. So I'm going to map those in, color, outline it, and now I'm going to color it in green. So this is one of the ecological communities that we are going to be mapping out and collecting details on, properties of. Okay. So I'm going to label this this community is, I'm going to label this the riparian woodland community. All right. Now we're going to be doing a little property sheet on each of these communities. There's little property sheets that we're going to be doing here. We'll do that a little bit later. So we'll be filling these out, and so you'll need to have those. I'll tell you what to fill out, and you're going to be filling those out, and you're going to need to know that information for the quizzes. But right now I'm just going to do the map of these first communities from the vista point here. All right, so that's our first community, riparian woodland. Now if you look down right below us, you should see some tall grasses. They're sort of waving in the wind right now. It's lovely. And these tall grasses represent a separate community. Okay. And if you look out just beyond this palm tree, you'll see another stand of tall grasses. And then over, nestled up right up against the tall trees that seem to be sticking out, you can see there's another little stand of grasses. So what I want to do is map out those grasses. I'm going to use a different color. So I'm going to start with the one just below us, which is, because this is where we are. So I'm going to color them in here. You've got a little lobe of tall grasses here. And then just beyond this little dry spot, there's another little lobe of grasses here. And then right up against those trees, there's another lobe of tall grasses. So we've got three little lobes of tall grasses here. And I'm going to call that the freshwater marsh. So that's freshwater marsh. Okay. So it's easy to recognize because, again, you've got this stand of really tall grasses and stuff. Now everything else from the riparian woodland and the freshwater marsh grasses out to the channel, that's all another community, and you can see it consists of very, very short plants. And in some cases, a bare spot, completely a bare spot. There's a bare spot over there, and there's a bare spot over here. But there's actually nothing at all. The light color, if you look at the soil on those bare spots, the light color is because of salts that have accumulated there. So everything else out to the channel, then, that is all an additional community, and this is called the Salt Barren. And I'm going to color that in. So on your map, you should be coloring these in too, and all of the land should be accounted for. There shouldn't be any blank spots on your map. I'm going to go out to about right here, as far as I can see right here. I'm going to go right here. And I'm going to save all the rest of this stuff for later because what we're going to do is we're going to walk down this road, and then we'll be able to see more of the extent of these communities here. So let me label this community. And this is called the Salt Barren.
That one went that way, right?
Okay.
That one went up that way.
So what I'm going to do now is going to walk down Back Bay Drive, and we'll make some stops along the way, and we'll stop and fill in our property sheets and color in our map.
There is a loop. It looks right. It looks, but it's 10 miles.
I wanted to describe the ecosystem that we were at. Earlier we were at Oak Canyon, which is an upland, woodland type of community. Here at Upper Newport Bay, the ecosystem here is what's called an estuary. And an estuary is it's a coastal embayment where you have fresh water coming in on the inland side. In this case, the fresh waters, if you look at the bridge behind me, that bridge crosses over the entry point for San Diego Creek, which drains much of the land from southern Tustin, Lake Forest, Laguna Hills. When it rains there, that water drains ultimately into San Diego Creek. That's fresh water, and then that drains into and then dumps into the bay. So the bay, at least on this end, is getting supplied with fresh water. On the ocean side, it's open to the ocean, and so this system, this bay, is exposed to the tidal movements of the ocean. So this bay and the rest of the Pacific Ocean along the California coast gets 2 high tides a day and 2 low tides a day. So twice a day, seawater floods into this part of the bay and then drains out, and then floods in and drains out. So you've got the sloshing of water. So during a part of the day, the bay is dominated by seawater from the ocean during high tide. And then the rest of the time of the day, at low tide, then at least this part of the bay is dominated by freshwater. So that represents a real stressful situation for the plants and animals that live here, because several things are happening. The saltiness of the water is changing twice a day. The temperature of the water is changing twice a day. And so that represents a real stress. But here's the bonus. The bonus is that with the input of these the water from upland and from the ocean, as that water comes in from the ocean, it also brings nutrients, mineral nutrients. And then as that water comes in from San Diego Creek, it also is bringing in nutrients. So despite that this is a very stressful environment in terms of salinity, temperature, water level, and so on, it's a very, very rich environment for plant productivity, phytoplankton productivity, and so on. So there are some plants and animals that can tolerate those changes, and as a consequence, they flourish. So Upper Newport Bay and all estuaries, it's a subsidized ecosystem, and as a consequence, it's a very productive place. All right, we've walked down the hill from the Vista Point, and now we are on the flat. Let me kind of show you where we are right now. Let me get my map out. We are about right here. We're about right here on the map, and behind me is some trees from the riparian woodland. So I want to fill out I'm not going to actually fill it out, but I'm going to verbalize the components in the riparian woodland. So what you need to do is flip to the page that shows the riparian woodland property sheet. And then I'm just going to point to things and verbalize. So my recommendation for you is to take a pen or a pencil and jot down what it is that I'm saying for each of these, okay? And then, because filling out these property sheets is going to be helpful for you when you come to take the quiz. So, first category is general description, very simple, dense stands of trees to 30 feet tall. would be how I would verbalize, or what I would write down if I was going to take time to write it. Dense stands of trees to 30 feet tall. Elevation and topography. We're just going to focus on elevation today. In all of these communities that we're seeing, the topography is going to be flat. So elevation for the riparian woodland is 3 to 5 feet above sea level. Now, this is very different. If you participated in the Oak Canyon activity, we were dealing with elevations of 700, 800 feet. But here, we're right near the ocean. And so in this case, we have to be a little bit more accurate. So right now, we're like 3 to 5 feet above sea level. Next is exposure to tidal influence. Never. This community is high enough that even in the highest high tides, the seawater never floods it. Soil moisture content generally is high, but I'm going to add an additional point. The groundwater is abundant, but it is usually 10 feet deep or more. So the point there is if you are a plant that lives here and you want access to that groundwater, you're going to have deep roots. Main source of soil moisture. All right, so I previously talked about how this is an estuary and water is sloshing back and forth in this basin. And you might think that, well, some of that water gets in here and that's why we have trees. Well, as it turns out, if you follow me around over here, I want to point out this little slope here, and it's muddy. This is muddy soil. And so what that means is that this soil is saturated with water. And where does the water come from? If you look at the curb, you can see the curb is also got standing water in it. And that's not from the rains. The water is actually draining, because if you look at the slope, you see it's filled with trees and shrubs. And the only time you get trees is when you have groundwater all year round. Trees need to have access to groundwater constantly all year round. So that means that this slope is saturated with water. And this water is coming from some underground source. So to respond to this question, the main source of soil moisture for the riparian woodland is drainage from upslope groundwater. Drainage from upslope groundwater. All right, next category, salt content of the soil, low, okay? It's low. We're going to see some of the communities that have higher salt content, but this one, very, very low. Oxygen content of the soil is high. And you may think, well, why do we care about oxygen content in the soil? And here, remember that these plants have their roots in the soil, and the roots are made up of living cells, and the living cells are conducting cellular respiration. So in order for cellular respiration to proceed, there needs to be an available supply of oxygen, and that's the point here. Some of the communities we see here, the soil has no oxygen in it, and so that is a mystery about how the roots in those plants can survive if there's no oxygen in the soil. All right, next category, dominant plants. Here's one, let me point to it. One of the plants we see here is this tree. This is called a black willow. The black willows is one of the taller willows. There's also a shorter willow called an arroyo willow over here. So this is an arroyo willow, A-R-R-O-Y-O. The trees over on, just come on across the street.
And I just had like no concept of what to do.
This is a Brazilian pepper tree. It's another one of the dominant plants. And then we're going to walk along and I might point out a couple of more. So I forgot, we had one more category, and that was observed birds and other animals. Right now I haven't seen any. If we see some, we'll try to capture them on the camera. But right now, none observed would be the way I would write a note in there, none observed. Okay, now we're done. Right, we've continued to walk on this road, and let me point out where we are right now. We are right here at this location on your map. Oops, right at that location on your map. And behind me is this extension of the salt barren. So I want to work on my map a little bit to include that salt barren. We couldn't see this part of the bay from our previous vantage point, the vista point. We walked down this road beyond the riparian, patch of riparian woodland, and now we're standing here. So, so you see an alleyway of the salt barren coming in and up to this road. It's bounded on our right by the riparian woodland, and on the left by where you can see the tall trees, where I'm pointing over here. Not tall trees, tall grass. So we have another patch of freshwater marsh over here. So I want to indicate this on our map. So as I mentioned, we are right here right now. The salt barren sort of comes in this narrow alleyway. I'm not quite sure how far out it goes, but I can definitely see that it goes out toward the channel, and this is all all salt barren. Now, I don't really know for sure. I suspect, based on the aerial photo, I suspect that this is all salt barren over here. But I'm going to wait until I get to this bend in the road, and then I'm going to be able to look back out in this direction, and I'll have better vision. In the meantime, to our left, there is this patch of tall grasses. So I can start to color in another instance, another patch of freshwater marsh. That's the tall grasses. So I can start coloring that in here. And then we're going to continue to walk down this road around the bend and then to this point. So we'll keep track of the distribution of the freshwater marsh as we walk down the road. So let's put our map away, and I want to go to the property sheet, characteristic sheet for the salt barren. It's the same the same categories as we saw with the riparian, but the characteristics are going to be different. All right, so turn your sheet so that it has the category for the salt barren, and let's go through these. I'm just going to verbalize them, you write them down. General description, as I mentioned before, it's a sort of a carpet of short plants to 1 foot high. Carpet of short plants to 1 foot high. Elevation and topography, well, now here it's a little bit lower as compared to the riparian woodland. So elevation and topography here is 1 to 3 feet above sea level. 1 to 3 feet above sea level for elevation and topography. Exposure to tidal influence, in this case, yeah, they do get a little bit of exposure. So here's what I want you to write down. Rarely exposed to high tides several times a year. Rarely exposed to high tides several times a year. There's another story about how that results in a buildup of salt, but I'm not going to tell that today. Soil moisture content, typically very dry. Typically very dry. Main source of soil moisture is seawater from rare high tides. Seawater from rare high tides. Salt content of the soil, well, they call it a salt barren, so you might imagine the salt concentration is very high. Salt content extremely high, I might add, extremely high. And the reason for that is because the high tides do bring in seawater, and the seawater has salt in it. Eventually the seawater drains away, and the moisture from the seawater in the soil, that eventually evaporates, but it leaves the salt behind. So if that continues over and over and over, but with just occasional tides, then the salt continues to increase over and over. So that's why we have very, very high salt content. Oxygen content of the soil, high. Dominant plants, let me point out one dominant plant that's here. It's not doing very well because I don't know why. This is saltgrass. So that's an easy one to remember. Saltgrass. And saltgrass, it deals with high salt content in the soil in an interesting way. It takes in the salty water and then it excretes the excess salt onto, or out through the stomata onto the leaves. If it hasn't been, it's been raining lately, so a lot of that salt is washed away, but sometimes if there hasn't been rain for quite a while, you can rub the leaves of the saltgrass and you can see little crystals of salt. So that's how it deals with it. It takes in the salty water, saves the water, but gets rid of a lot of the salt. So that's a cool thing. Another plant that is here, and I can't show you right now, is bladderpod. Not bladderpod. Pickleweed. Pickleweed. And I'll show you a pickleweed a little bit later on and show you how that how pickleweed deals with salt. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk down a bit, continue on, start mapping out our freshwater marsh a little bit more, and then we'll do a property sheet for the freshwater marsh. I wanted to stop and point out this plant here. This is a freshwater marsh plant, and it's called a sedge. And sedges have edges, and the reason it has edges is it's got a triangular sort of cross section. Now, what's interesting about this plant, and the reason I wanted to point it out, is that if you squish it, there's space in here. I'm gonna break off a section of old sedge grass so that you can see. And if you look inside, you can see it's like little tiny tubes that are running up the stem of the plant. And these tubes are filled with air. And that becomes important later on when we think about the properties of the freshwater marsh. The soil has no oxygen in it, and yet we have some plants that have hollow stems. So I want you to think about the significance of that. So I just wanted to point this out. There's another plant that shares this community as well that also has hollow stems, and I'll point that out later. Right, so you're seeing a shot of some trickling water moving across the, sort of a shallow pool. And it's very shallow. The water is only about maybe 6 inches deep. And this is typical for marshes. Marshes are basically flooded terrain, but flooded only by a few inches of water, and many plants can't live in flooded soil, but these plants can, including the sedge that I showed you earlier. If you look down here, let me show you this. These are cut sections of one of the grasses that dominates the freshwater marsh. This is a cattail, and you can see it's got hollow tubes that run down the stem. That seems to be a property of the main plants in the freshwater marsh, is they tend to have hollow tubes. All right, so let's do a property sheet for the freshwater marsh. We walked just a short distance from where we stopped before with the doing the property sheet for the salt barren. So let's do one for the freshwater marsh here. Right, so turn in your little packet, turn to the page that has freshwater marsh, and so let's just do this. So general description would be dense stands of grass to 10 feet tall. That's how I would describe it. Dense stands of grass to 10 feet tall. Elevation and topography. Well, it turns out the elevation is the same as the salt barren. So it's 1 to 3 feet above sea level. Why does this have grass and the salt barren doesn't? Exposure to tidal influence, it's the same as with the salt barren. Rarely exposed to high tides, several times a year. Rarely exposed to high tides, several times a year. Soil moisture content, well, now this is where it's very different from the salt barren. Soil moisture content is soil is saturated and it's submerged under several inches of fresh water. Saturated and submerged under several inches of fresh water. Main source of soil moisture, this is a property that it shares with the riparian woodland. Main source of soil moisture is drainage from upslope groundwater, and so it's coming from the slope behind you right now. So there's moisture in that slope, in the groundwater, there's groundwater in that slope, and it's draining toward the bay and into this flat part of the bay. Salt content of soil, very low. Oxygen content of soil, now this is a new one. There's no oxygen in the soil. Zero oxygen in the soil. Dominant plants, we talked about, showed you the sedge. That's edge with an S in front, S-E-D-G-E. And then cattails. That's you can see behind me. These are the cattails, the ones we just saw the hollow tubes in those. Observe birds and other animals. Well, we're not really seeing any, so I keep forgetting to talk about this. I didn't talk about it with the salt barren, but I don't see any birds. I did hear earlier an animal right at this spot, and I'm listening for it now, and I'm not hearing it, so darn it. I wanted to be able to share that with you. But I don't see it now, so none observed would be the way I'd have to report it. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue to walk down this road, and we'll map out the freshwater marsh as we go, and let's just move that. So we've been continuing to walk, and we noticed that the freshwater marsh is now interrupted by this patch of salt barren that you can see travels all the way out to the channel. And then as we continue on to your left, we're starting to see more freshwater marsh. So we've got a new lobe of freshwater marsh ahead of us. But what I want to do is update my map to reflect this interruption in the freshwater marsh. If you heard that bird, we can put that in our freshwater marsh. Sounds like a little machine gun going off. Hear it? That's a marsh wren, so you can jot that down. This is their vocal time of year. Springtime is, oh, by the way, this is the first day of spring in 2020. So they tend to be very vocal. So, all right, so what I want to do is figure out where we are. We're about right here on the map. We're about right here. So that freshwater marsh continued on up to about this location. So I'm going to color it in. We walked along, we stopped there. We walked along, and then we're about right here now. So, and then it gets interrupted. We know it starts up again just by that curve in the road, so I'm going to just start that there. And then everything else from this point on, this is all more salt barren. So I'm going to just put that to show that the salt barren, and I can see that all the way out to the channel, by the way. So I'm just going to color it out this far right now. And then we're going to continue. You hear those marsh wrens, they're so fun. Then we're going to... I really prefer the sound, I'd rather be interrupted by marsh wrens than big jet aircraft flying out of John Wayne Airport. So we're going to go to this corner, and we'll continue on mapping out the freshwater marsh. So we've now come to this bend in the road. We're right here, right now. And what I want to do is basically I want to finish up this portion of the map based on our ability to see back so we can get a sense of the extent of the salt barren and then also the remains of the last lobe of the freshwater marsh. So let's do the marsh first. I've got my blue pencil out for the marsh. So we're right here, and that marsh kind of ends a little bit before the bend. Goes out a little bit like so. Something like that. That's good enough. That's good enough. And I can also look back. I can also look back from this perspective and see how far the marsh comes out. So it kind of comes out to about here, pretty far out. So I'm going to finish up this part of the topo map, not topo map, this part of the map, and we're done with the freshwater marsh distribution. So what I want to do is I want to finish up with the salt barren. And this is the last we're going to see of the salt barren. So everything else up to this line here, and this line is if you look where I'm pointing, you can see this raised berm of earth. And so that represents, it's kind of broken in some spots, but that raised berm of earth shows up on this aerial photo as this white line here. That berm was part of an old salt works that used to operate here in the upper Newport Bay. And as part of the salt works, they would let in seawater into, they had the bay, this part of the bay sort of broken up into a bunch of little pools. I don't know how I want to say, subdivided, that's the word I wanted. Subdivided into a bunch of little pools, and they let the seawater in at high tide, close off the pools, and let the trapped water evaporate, and they would do that for several months, and then eventually the evaporated water would leave salt, and then they would scrape up the salt and sell it. So that little berm that you can see here, that raised berm, is part of the old salt works. All right, so what that means is this berm represents the farthest extent of the salt barren, so I'm going to color in everything else. I'm going to color in everything else that I haven't colored in so far on this side of the bay. Oops, got a little bit into the freshwater marsh there. Okay, so we are done with this portion of the map. That leaves these two big areas, and we're going to go to our last spot next. But before we go, I wanted to point out, as I promised you, I wanted to point out bladderpod. And bladderpod, I keep calling it bladderpod, it's pickleweed. This is a never-ending problem for me. I always get those two names for years and years, always get them mixed up. So this is pickleweed. So here's a little strand of pickleweed, and no, it's not an endangered plant. So, and the reason they call it pickleweed is because it's arranged like it's got little pickles stuck end on end. And the way it works is, pickleweed can live in salty soil. What it does is it absorbs the salty water, and then what it does is then it shunts some of that salt to the tip of one of its pickles, and so that tip concentrates the salt. And after a time, that salt kills that part of the plant, and then that little part of the plant breaks off and takes the salt with it, so it sacrifices part of itself to get rid of the salt. So it's a different style of salt management as compared to saltgrass. Okay, so let's go to our last point. Okay, last stop. So we're at our last stop. Let me show you where we are. We are right here. This is our location right now. So we started off up here on the Vista Point and then walked down Back Bay Drive, around the curve, and now we're at our last point. And so what we're going to do is map out where there's one more community that we want to get a record of, and that's what you see behind me. All of that short grass. It goes to about maybe 3 feet tall, and it extends out to the channel that you can see, across the channel, and then out as far as the foot of that bluff on the far side of the basin. So I want to map that out. I want to color that in. That is our next and final community, and that is the salt marsh. So I'm going to color in all of this on this side, all of this space on this side of the channel. This is all salt marsh, and then we'll fill out a property sheet for it in a moment. And then all on the other side too. This is all salt marsh here as well. So this is a pretty big community, and it's very special. It's a lot to color in. Ooh, I hear a Canada goose. But several Canada geese. Huh? All right, so that's, let me label this. Let me walk over here. So this is salt marsh. That's salt marsh. That's our last community here. So let's do a property sheet for the salt marsh. Let's see. Okay, real quick. Salt marsh. Make sure you have your property sheet for salt marsh. So general description, as you can see, dense stands of grass to 3 feet tall. Dense stands of grass to 3 feet tall. Elevation and topography. So this is a very different community in terms of elevation. This is unique among the four. What is that noise? Elevation and topography for the, where am I here? Salt marsh is 0 feet. 0 feet. It is in the intertidal zone. It is 0 feet in the intertidal zone. That means it's between the tides. Intertidal literally means between the tides. So exposure to tidal influence, next category. It gets exposed to 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day. So it's daily exposure to tidal influence every day. It gets flooded by seawater at high tide, and then it's drained at low tide. Soil moisture content, it's quite, well, it's saturated, like, because it's a marsh. So soil moisture content, it is saturated, often submerged under several feet of seawater. Main source of soil moisture is going to be seawater at high tide. Seawater at high tide. Salt content of the soil is moderate. that is equivalent to that of seawater, which is about 3.4%, or if you're an oceanographer, it's 34 parts per thousand. So salt content of the soil is moderate, equivalent to that of seawater. Oxygen content of the soil is 0. So both marshes have no oxygen in the soil. So 0 oxygen, no oxygen in the soil. Dominant plants, the dominant plant that you can see is cordgrass. And so that's spelled C-O-R-D. That's the dominant plant's cordgrass. So observed birds and animals. I'd like to say maybe those geese, but they really were just flying over. There are some shorebirds if you take a look. There are some shorebirds feeding along the channel there. So we could just simply say associated, and by the way, what you're seeing out beyond there, that's all more salt marsh. So we could include those as observed birds. We could just say assorted shorebirds. Assorted shorebirds. All right. So that concludes our visit, my visit, to Upper Newport Bay. Make sure that if you don't have your property sheets filled out and your map filled out right now, make sure you go back and review this video for those parts that you missed, and then study this document before you take the quiz on it, because the quiz is going to ask you questions about the locations of. So there'll be a map on the quiz. There'll be a map like this on the quiz. It won't be colored in. Well, actually it will be, because it's multiple choice. It's because it's online, right? You can't color it in online. So you're going to need to remember where the ecological communities are, what their names are, and then plus you're going to need to be familiar with the various properties, physical properties of each of the 4 communities. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Yeah! Welcome to Upper Newport Bay! No? Too much?